Well, now it's my pleasure, after those two very informative and stimulating presentations, to convene a panel of the industry itself and a kind of response, and provide a response to some of the loose ends and unanswered questions that still surround the regulations here. So it's my pleasure to invite to the stage Justin Franssen, who was speaking earlier and giving a question, Peter Paul de Groot, and David Foster. While biographies are obviously in the conference program, I'm not sure if this is a fully open secret, but Peter Paul, although you're here as a representative of Quod Bonum, you will, on the 1st of July, I believe, take a new role as the Chief Executive or Managing Director of Spiel Verantwoord, the industry lobbying group, and provide a new voice for the Dutch industry.
Yes, that's correct. I'm looking forward to it very much. But today I will be speaking not in that capacity, as the role starts for the 1st of July.
Justin, you'll be speaking in your usual capacity as provocateur and advocate. And David Foster from GVC, with a lot of experience of the Dutch market. Now, we had a preparatory call for this panel yesterday, and we found certain topics that stood out, and we wanted to investigate a little further. And I guess the advertising issue, which has been raised already a number of times, we would like to look a bit further towards that, and really to look at, I suppose, the question of what is the best balance to strike between the public policy concerns that are obviously informing advertising restrictions in markets like the UK, Belgium, and Sweden, and the actual reality of academic research, which doesn't really actually indicate a great deal of harm that's created by gambling industry advertising, except perhaps in a very small instance for those people who are trying to quit or self-exclude. The evidence really isn't there. So the restrictions seem to be driven by a public policy debate. How does the industry go ahead and address those concerns? Peter Paul, perhaps to kick it off first.
Yeah, I'd like to flip it a little bit and look at why advertising is important, because it potentially leads players to the regulated offer. So the channelization role of advertising is paramount, is important, and that's why I think that advertising should be allowed. But then the other side, of course, is that when there are no restrictions, you end up in a bonanza, especially in a market that just opens. And people will be spammed with advertising for gambling, even if they are not interested in gambling. So it's a conundrum, really, to find the right way to offset that.
Justin, we've heard about the licensing, the expressions of interest for licenses, and the expectation probably that there'll be a lot more people interested this time around than last time. If we had, for example, in Holland, a market like Sweden with 120 licenses, what kind of clamour for advertising would that create?
Sorry, could you
repeat? What kind of clamour for advertising in the market would that create? Would that be too many licenses? Would there be necessary to have some kind of...
I honestly don't know whether that would be too much or well, what can you say about it? But what you typically see in any market that opens after, let's say, 24 to 36 months, some operators simply depart the market because they have a small market share, or the regulator puts on extra requirements, or the market is certainly not commercially attractive enough. So, I mean, you may start off with the 130 applicants we saw in Sweden, but then there will be a shakedown very, very soon after. Maybe to get back to advertising, I mean, I was actually especially struck by what happened in Italy, where they went for a total ban. And in a way, gambling is then put in the same category as tobacco. But you simply can't do that. With tobacco, it's quite. I mean, I used to be a smoker, so I know every cigarette is bad for you. So there is logic in banning tobacco advertising. Whereas for gambling activities, I think 98% of the people play responsibly and, as a general leisure activity. So a complete ban would be grossly exaggerated, I think, and not necessary. And surely, think about it. You're spending an awful lot of money and investing an awful lot of money for a license in the Netherlands. We saw the report of the Gambling Authority, and René Janssen was referring to it before. You have the initial investment of hundreds of thousands of euros. You're paying the license fee and so forth. But then think about it. If you've never been on the market, for whatever, not passively available, not actively available, not at all, right? You're trying to get a market share. How can you do that? How can you possibly do that without, getting out there, at least in some shape, way, or form, to let the audience know you're there, right? So the sort of populist approach, there should be like a ban on gambling, I think is going to backfire. I mean, if it would be implemented like that, it's going to backfire massively on the channelization objectives. And I'm hopeful and that this ministry is not going to do that. So if you look at the words of the minister, they look sensible to me. So yes, there might be some additional restrictions, but we're not going to the extremes of Italy. But that's looking in the crystal ball. We still have to wait a little bit more for stuff coming out from the ministry here.
David, in the UK, the GVC has somewhat surprised the market a few weeks ago by announcing its own voluntary ban on sponsorship. That followed an industry voluntary ban on whistle-to-whistle advertising during broadcasts of sports games. Is there a space in the Dutch market for the industry to take an initiative and get out ahead of any potential ban?
Absolutely. I think the Dutch market, it's going to be a very important test case for us now. I think we've seen what's happened in a number of other jurisdictions, and the Dutch market is the next one on the horizon that's going to open up. And I think the industry has got to get it right this time and got to strike the right balance. Clearly, things like the initiatives that have happened in the UK have been a step in the right direction. But I think as we see in Sweden recently, where the rules, the regulations stated that advertising should be done in moderation without providing any more detail, which is kind of probably what the industry asked for at the time, a principles-led approach rather than one that's very prescriptive. And I think probably on balance we've got it a bit wrong as an industry there, and there's been pushback, and now we're facing a lot of difficult questions. So I think the role of sort of self-regulation is going to be important, but that needs to be done not purely in a vacuum as the industry. That needs to be done in conjunction with the regulator and also with the broadcasters and media houses as well. It's all well and good coming up with principles and guidelines, but these need to be adhered to by all the stakeholders that are involved. So I've no doubt that one of Peter Paul's first jobs will be to look at this issue and make sure that the industry is prepared better than perhaps it has been in other jurisdictions, learning from some of the mistakes, but also using some of the things that initiatives and proactive measures that have been taken and incorporating them as well, so that hopefully we can get on the front foot and divert some of the headlines away from the negative headlines away from advertising.
At last week's European Lotteries Congress in Antwerp, it was very clear that the lotteries were heading in the direction of lobbying very firmly to reconsideration of the 2014 European Commission player protection guidelines, which say that member states should take a very serious look at the risk factors involved in each type of gambling and amend their regulations on advertising accordingly. Now, what would that mean in the Dutch market? I mean, is there a place for that? You know more about lotteries than most of us here.
Don't remind me. Well, I think it would be wrong to go that way, because in the Dutch market you have the national lottery operator who has stated publicly that they intend to offer games of chance. So I think if they would, stay on their own turf, lotteries only, you could argue for it. But I think they shouldn't be put in such an advantageous position. I wouldn't favour it.
I mean, you're getting into a very strange situation where, let's say, the NLO would be able to continue their marketing spend for their, let's say, less dangerous lottery games. But at the same time, of course, they are able to build on their brand.
Yeah.
And if you would then put restrictions on the remote gaming offering, it would, from a competitive perspective, would be quite strange, I guess. But I mean, in quite general terms, we of course discussed this yesterday. I think there's three options, essentially. If you look at what happened in the UK, right? There, the industry reaction came in too slow. And now, there's a lashback from Parliament and from public perception, from the media. And all the, let's say, actions may come a bit too late. Maybe even including the step Kenny Alexander took, the CEO of GVC, to stop actually the sponsorship of the jersey sponsorship. It's either you self-regulate, right, or you co-regulate. And I think I very much agree with Peter Paul. This is something you probably better do in conjunction with the regulator, because it's not just this industry, but generally speaking, if you look at self-regulation, if there is no, let's say, incentive to comply, it's difficult. Maybe especially in this industry, because it's so cutthroat in terms of the competition. So I would very much favor sort of a co-regulation and go for a preemptive strike. So let's go first and not wait for the regulator to hit back if it's too late. And there is a responsibility of the industry. Simple as that, in my view.
David, one of the problems we've had in the UK is that operators have taken their advertisements and had them approved by Clearcast, which is the body that approves broadcast advertising, but then found themselves sanctioned by the Advertising Standards Authority, which is subject to more public policy pressure. There's lots of feeling that there's not enough guidance about what the right tone is for advertising in the UK, and inconsistency between the regulators who supervise it. What is the way around that? Is there any way around that?
Well, I think learning from mistakes. I think a few years ago, generally advertising, certainly in the case of the UK, was often more aggressive, and I think the tone of it didn't necessarily endear itself to people. And I think quite a lot has been done to address that in terms of certain sign-up incentives are now no longer allowed, and certain messaging in and around that. But I think once that kind of issue of tone had been addressed to a certain extent, then the next issue was volume. And people would simply say, I watch football, and at half-time there are wall-to-wall gambling adverts. And that's obviously been played out in other jurisdictions as well. So I think we need to be a bit more savvy and a bit more smart. And work, together, as we said before, to come up with an appropriate balance that's not going to, you can see it not necessarily speaking to politicians or the media or the industry. Your friends, your family, what's their kind of impression of it? That's quite a good test case for what public perception is. And generally, people have had issues with it. And I think that we've started to learn from that, and you're seeing the style of advertisement has changed a little bit. I think there's plenty more scope for improvement. I think you can see in industries like alcohol, for example, which we're often sort of compared to, has actually been very good and very proactive in certain cases, and a lot more emphasis on CSR and drink responsibly and these kind of things, and they've actually used it to their advantage, I think, in terms of positioning their industry and the brands within that. So I think there's definitely scope for us to kind of mirror some of that stuff and make some progress in that direction.
I think you could possibly make the case that rather than looking at alcohol or tobacco, that it's perhaps more akin to the debate around sugar in food or drinks, because the actual instance of sugar in food and drinks is declining, as is the instance of problem or disordered gambling, but the volume of public debate continues to increase around it. It's hard to get away from that public moral panic. So I wanted to just to re-ask the question that I asked Dennis. Do you, in the absence of, or in the event of an advertising ban, what dangers are there from those operators who will never seek a license in the Dutch market, but will continue to seek Dutch play? Do you think the affiliate, or do you think the offshore piece is a worrying one?
I think the longer this process is dragged out for, the more the issue has been exacerbated, really. I think whilst you have clearly a large number of multinational operators who are interested in obtaining a license in the Netherlands and building a sustainable business here, the longer the process has gone on for, the longer they haven't been able to, do that, to invest into advertising, to, build a more sustainable business. But the whole time that has carried on, you've obviously had affiliate activity and smaller operators who probably have no intention of obtaining a license in the Netherlands, but yet I think they've taken the view that make hay while the sun's shining, really, and as long as the market is unregulated and the big boys aren't there to kind of have that brand awareness, they're going to try and make everything they can in that period of time. And it's a difficult situation to police, but it's something that I think the regulator and the authorities are aware of, and hopefully one that they will address, because the whole time that situation's occurring, these are potentially customers that might not come back on shore as and when the market does regulate. If they've been with a certain company for a long period of time, it's quite difficult to then bring them back, particularly if we're in a situation where advertising is maybe not quite as in your face as it has been in other jurisdictions.
I mean, you're not speaking for the industry completely just yet, but it is a problem for the legitimate licensed operators.
Yes, absolutely.
To articulate.
Yeah, it is, and I think it will be pivotal because I think if there would be an advertising ban, the channelization goals will not be met. I can't see it happening.
Speaking of things that are banned in the current regulations and are available elsewhere, I wanted to move on, and we've already kind of segued into the question of betting on lotteries. Now that's obviously quite a big area of player interest. In Germany, I was surprised to find it's bigger than poker, in the sense that there's 280 million euros of turnover of betting on secondary lotteries versus 120 on poker.
What that tells you is that poker is really small in Germany.
Yeah. I mean, also,
compared
if you look at those
to the
figures,
compared to the size of the lottery market, I mean, betting on lotteries is absolutely dwarfed.
But if you look at those figures from, I think it's Westlotter, they also show a decline in the incidence of people betting on secondary lotteries. I mean, is it necessary now to regulate the betting on secondary lotteries for the Dutch market, or are we just going to assume it's going away?
It's an interesting question. In the past few years, I always had the understanding that betting on lotteries would be expressly banned or forbidden. But I've been going through the draft regulation and legislation, and I couldn't find any reference to it. I'm not saying that if it's not specifically banned, it is therefore allowed, but there will be companies that take that position. Now, for instance, it's interesting to look at what happened in Sweden, because someone once asked me, mention one country that allows betting on lotteries. Well, Sweden allows betting on lotteries specifically, but they have a little clause in there that says that you have to get permission from the lottery on which you base the bet on, that you can use their lottery to put the bet out. But yes, it's going to be interesting. I don't know. I don't have any figures about how big the betting on lottery market in the Netherlands is. But I do know that when companies such as Lottoland, smell an opportunity, they will be there.
You also raised the question when we were speaking yesterday about things that are currently, done within a bookmaking license, for instance, but on a popular bet or products, but are going to be excluded from this licensing at the appearance, based on what we know now of it. I mean, there are. I guess I wanted to broaden the discussion out into the whole betting catalogue issue and what is and is not included in this, and what risks and dangers that presents.
Well, as we heard before, we don't know what's going to be in the catalogue. That's the mystery which is going to unfold very soon, I hope, towards the end of June. That's the planning, at least I heard. I think the whole catalogue discussion is a bit concerning, because I was just looking this morning at I just picked one large international operator, just to look at how many opportunities they provide a year, and we're talking about 600. There were bets on 600,000 events annually, and way over 7 million individual bets were possible. But if you look at the criteria you have to adhere, if they're not changed, we don't know if they're changed after the consultation round, but it's extremely, if you literally apply them, it's extremely laborious, and I think this particular operator would need 50 to 100 new employees to comply to the criteria as they are now. So it's unworkable, I think, or difficult to work with, to put it mildly, for the operators. It's also very difficult to work with for the regulator. So I'm very much hoping that these requirements have been softened, or at least thought has been put into it, because it's just imagine what it would take to just put out one single bet. If you're doing 7 million of them a year, and this is just one operator, we're talking 130 licensees, so or potential licensees. So it's unless, of course, you have a very smart automated system, which is, I don't think, yet in place. But that's going to be extremely complicated. I'm really hoping that these considerations are taken to heart by the regulator.
David, what's been, obviously you've got a long history, but even before GVC in betting markets in Europe, what's been your experience of working in those markets with restricted catalogues? And
I think Italy was an example of where there was a system in place whereby you'd have to have markets pre-approved before they were posted, and I think that was, I didn't work closely on the Italian market, but quite burdensome from an operator perspective, certainly. But looking at this from a sort of an integrity perspective, I understand there's a simplified argument, if you don't offer these certain markets, there won't be match fixing. But I think it's a bit more nuanced than that. I think we've touched already on the argument around the need to offer these markets where there is consumer demand in order to channel consumers to the regulated market. That's quite a well-versed argument. But second to that, in some of the particular markets that I've heard discussed as possible examples that maybe might not be permitted, subject to consultation, there's generally very sort of small liquidity in these markets, and actually it's quite easy from an operator perspective to identify where there is potentially suspicious activity. That might be very large bets, unusually high volumes, price movements, etc., etc. But I think from an integrity perspective, it's actually quite helpful to have an operator there to shine a light on certain instances where this might be happening, to then work with the regulators, work with the sporting bodies to try and sort of overcome these the sources of this corruption. And then sort of thirdly, I suppose, is also international betting markets are international, just because perhaps there'll be certain restrictions imposed by virtue of having a Dutch license. That doesn't mean that necessarily in other jurisdictions those same restrictions will be imposed. So, for example, if you can't bet on a certain market in the Netherlands in the future, you may well be able to do it in the UK or in France or in Belgium. So there's a lot more that needs to be considered. I think it shouldn't be sort of simplified, but it's clearly a subject that's going to probably be one of the more controversial ones, I suspect, over the next few months.
We didn't mention it in our talk yesterday, but obviously another thing that's coming up this year now is the ratification of the Mechelen Convention, European Convention on Match Fixing, which comes into force on September 1st. So you could have a match being fixed in Holland, but the bets being taken, or the bets being arranged in Bulgaria, for instance. What changes do you think the Mechelen Convention could bring? What benefits or what weaknesses are there?
Well, I think the general principle is around cooperation and collaboration on an international, trans-border basis, which I think is only a good thing. I think actually a lot of what is outlined in the convention is probably already being done, but certainly it will be helpful to kind of encourage that and try and hopefully take that to the next step. But I think from a practical perspective, lots of the large international operators and regulators, there is cooperation. There are platforms in place at national level. There is cooperation sharing agreements between regulators, between national platforms. There's institutions like, well, it's formerly known as ESSA until yesterday, but as of yesterday, the International Betting Integrity Association, which brings together a large number of large international operators to work together to monitor their markets, share information, identify potentially suspicious activity and report that. So I think the convention is definitely a step in the right direction. I don't think it's going to have a transformational impact, but it certainly is another template which will help try and take the cooperation and collaboration forward to the next level, really.
But in the meantime, I guess you're saying that operators are best placed to determine what is a risky bet and what is not, or a danger.
Yeah, I think having by virtue of what operators do and managing their risk in their markets, then having oversight of the bets, of the teams, of the markets, of the particular circumstances around suspicious activity, absolutely they're well placed. But that doesn't mean to say that whatever an operator says goes. I think there has to be that debate, and I think that debate is taking place. But we're always here to engage in dialogue and to discuss these matters. And if there is very compelling evidence around, certain changes that maybe need to be made in terms of the way we collaborate on a holistic basis, on a large scale, then we should look at that. We can't pretend that everything's absolutely fine and the system we have today will be fine in 20 years' time. As with many other things, things change, we need to innovate, we need to continue improving, and that discussion needs to keep taking place.
Justin, right now in the Dutch regulations, there's no proviso for betting on esports. Should there be?
Not necessarily, I think. I mean, for as long as Dennis was explaining, there is a, let's say, sporting authority which is checking if the sports is clean. I don't see any material difference between betting on a soccer game or betting on esports. Of course, these organizations generally tend to be quite young and inexperienced, but I don't see a particular issue there. I mean, we've seen the first cases of match fixing also in esports betting, but so it should be carefully watched. But it's with every event. So I don't think it needs special attention to that extent.
But esports betting also involves so-called skins betting, or betting on value-added items in the games, and also potentially loot boxes in some versions. Those are topics that get regulators really excited at the moment. They always appear at the top of the list of things that regulators want to crack down on. Isn't that a concern? Do we not open the Pandora's box of loot boxes and...
Well, don't get me started. But betting on skin betting, I can't see that fitting in the current regulations, but Dennis is nodding no. That's good. I was scared for a bit, I had it wrong. But and then loot boxes, that's a whole, it's a complicated discussion. It's you can take different views on it, but I mean, randomized game items, let's call them that, in games have been of all times. It's nothing new. I mean, there's a whole fuss about loot boxes. There's no definition of loot boxes in the first place. But, you know, to have randomized game items, I mean, when I was a kid, I was playing Amiga 500. There were randomized game items there. Didn't pay for them, though. And I could, I mean, later in life, when the internet started, I could do account sales. So, you know, economic value or price was created. It's an incredibly difficult discussion. I think you can also see the regulators across the world are grappling with and fighting with the concept. They're not entirely sure. And, you know, maybe you could come to the conclusion that the current definitions are, you know, up for review. What is gambling? I mean, that's it has become very fluid. Of course, we see the demarcation between gaming and gambling becoming very fluid over the years. We're seeing new concepts, new games. I mean, we also had a definition back in time, for instance, on are binary options in CFDs. Are these still good? Yeah. Are these gambling games or not? Ultimately, it was decided it's financial. It's a financial product. So, you know, on that, I would say, not just in the Netherlands, but also in other jurisdictions, this may require a rethink of the definition of gambling, or maybe requires specific regulation.
I mean, is it worthwhile talking about also daily fantasy sports, which is another thing that's not regulated here, and you know, seems to have different.
You like to go into the niches of the gambling industry. Well, I'm not going to say it's gambling, but DFS. I mean, it's a difficult one. To me, I mean, it's still unclear where the regulator and the legislator are going to put the category. You know, is it skill game? Is it skill gaming? Is it betting? What category is it? What is sure to me is that it's incredibly difficult to apply all the nitty-gritty criterion for sports betting to DFS. I mean, it simply makes the business model totally unviable. So if you would put in the category as sports betting.
Yes, all of the things that Dennis was talking about, professional sports only and so on, checking out the financial integrity of the teams and so on. It doesn't.
Yeah, my inclination is that the regulator for the next foreseeable you know, years will primarily focus on, let's say, the known categories and the niches. Of course, they have to be touched at some point, but you know, that's maybe for a later concern. But who knows?
We have some time for some questions if anyone has got a burning issue they'd like to touch on here. Willem's got some mics, I think. If we don't have any questions, I was going to ask a little bit more about the likely. Well, we talked a little earlier on about the big bang, about the release of licenses. Now, what are the dangers of this process, or what happens if it doesn't all debut on day one for the market?
Yeah, it's going to be interesting to see what happens, because if you would deal with every application on a first-come, first-served basis, what would that do to, let's say, your time to market? So opening the market with a big bang sounds very attractive, but how does it go in practice? I mean, I see this as a big challenge. And for new entrants, it will be particularly interesting to see how this is dealt with by the regulator.
Who is pretty much guaranteed to be there on day one?
Well, I think the incumbents have a head start because they are well known to the regulator. They have licenses already. They also know what it is to do a license application process, so they have a head start. New entrants, smaller companies with less financial, well, let's say financial sources or deep pockets, For them, it will be particularly hard to keep up with the big boys, so to speak. So that, it might create a barrier to entry where you're in fact trying to take away barriers to entry, or within reasonableness, of course. But so there are two conflicting powers
Impulses,
there.
You have to be a bit speculative on this, but we can only draw by what Mario Appelman, the former CEO of the Gambling Authority, stated. I guess it was 2 years ago. I'm not entirely sure, but she was very vocal in saying that the Gambling Authority at the time would go for a big bang market opening, mainly driven by concerns about unfair competition. But since then, of course, things have moved on. And we're now confronted with the motion postuma, which in my view, by the way, is it's a bit risky what I'm going to say. So don't quote me on it.
Choose your words carefully.
Yeah. But to me, excuse me, it sounds a bit like politically the acceptance of a toleration policy. If you're going to say you will be potential, or the fact that you are on the market and you remain passively available like you've done years before, and you will do this for a 24-month unbroken period, this is not going to hinder your successful license application. So you're de facto tolerating the continuation of the services, albeit very passively available, take away the Dutch payment instruments and so forth, and be very, very quiet on your offering, which is the line I think we've been seeing for the last 8 years. So it's nothing new. I actually forgot what I wanted to say. I just jumped to the motion postuma. Could you help me? Where was I?
We were talking about the Big Bang process and what
the Big Bang. Sorry,
what could be done
sorry.
to make
Apologies
it less.
for that. No, so postuma. So you have maybe have the Big Bang for the first batch of licensees, right? NLO, HC, and so forth, and some of these squeaky clean operators who've never touched the Dutch market. That could go in a Big Bang on the 1st of January 2021. But then you'll have a series of situations which are all very different, because some operators may have discontinued their services on the market 3 years ago, and if they apply on the 1st of July, they have maybe complied with a 24-month cooling off period. Some of them may be discontinued, let's say, the use of typical Dutch payment instruments on the 19th or the 20th of February. So you can't then, in my view at least, you can't say to the others who complied, for the lack of a better word, earlier, you can't say to them, oh, okay, let's wait for half a year, sit on your hands, and then you can go in the second batch. So that would be the mini bang, you could say, and then you have a series of, that would be the replication of Spain, where you had this licensing windows, and at the end of the window they would give out the licenses, right? We're now in a different situation. It's a different world today. So it's a big bang, and then again, it's speculative, but you can't do it like it was originally, let's say, thought of by the CASA. It's no longer possible, I guess.
David, what's your expectations? So Kenny, I think on the Q1 GVC call this year said that he was expecting the Q1 21 for a start for GVC.
Oh, he's been saying that for about 5 or 6 years.
I haven't moved, yeah.
I think Justin hit the nail on the head, really. I think that the principle of a big bang is a sound one, and it would make logical sense, but I think reality has moved on since then, given the delays that have happened and also the nature of enforcement that's taken place. So it's going to be very interesting to see how that original notion of level playing field, competitive equality actually plays out in reality when the market does come to open. And I suppose how that also plays out for something like advertising, for example. If the market opens on the 1st of January 2021 and there's a large number of operators obtain their license successfully. Yet there's a bit of a lead time between when some of the others, whether they come in drips and drabs or there's another second date in mind, that remains to be seen. But then they're obviously, they're a few months behind everyone else. They've been waiting 15 years, they're a few months behind everyone else. How are they going to reconcile that from a marketing perspective? So there's definitely some interesting things that have come out of that, and we're obviously very interested to see how those discussions play out in the coming weeks in and around the policy rules and exactly
so
how
the
it's gonna
advertising
work.
issue conundrum has the potential to distort the Big Bang even more.
I think it's certainly not going to help. I think in order for that kind of self-regulation and that effective moderation to take place, it's going to be much easier if everyone's working on a level playing field. If all of a sudden people are coming from different positions at different times, it's inherently going to make it much harder to achieve that, I think, in my view.
Yeah, I agree. You had something to say. Yeah. Well, we've got, I think, 2 or 3 minutes left. Possible questions from anyone in the audience? If not, there's one. Please say who you are and where you're from.
Yes, Joris Dickers from Delta Markets. What we've seen over the last 2 years is that the gambling authority has given a multitude of fines to mostly stock-listed operators, such as Betson, Unibet. Unibet has not been fined, but has been blocked from advertising. William Hill, and so on. Thereby, the online space, let's say the affiliates, have had to withdraw all these brands from their websites. And what we see now, and also for the coming 24 months until the market will open, is that all these affiliates, let's not mistake, they generate more than 10 to 15,000 new customers every month altogether. Are actually advertising shady Cyprus or even Russia-based online casino platforms. How is that protecting the Dutch consumer, and how is that adding to a channelization, a higher channelization?
Thank you for that question. Yeah, we touched on the affiliate dilemma before, but worth revisiting it, I think, because it's very real.
It's simply not, of course. Joris, you're absolutely right. It's horrible from a consumer protection angle. And I'm also slightly concerned, I think also David made this remark, that those clients or customers will not return to the regulated market because they are confronted with, potentially less attractive product offering and so forth. Simply stated, this actually demonstrates what you're saying, that we should have these licenses up in the air sooner rather than later. And I would actually much rather see the situation as we have seen in the gaming machine sector. Think about it. Until the mid-80s, the payout at the gaming machines were illegal, right? I can't remember of any operator at the time who heard, well, you have to wait for 24 months before you are the recipient of a license. They all got a license for the very simple reason that, the objective was to properly regulate and channelize. So I'm not entirely happy, of course, with the delays, the further delays also caused by this motion customer. But it's a political reality we have to deal with, and hopefully the regulator and the legislator deals with it in a sensible way. But I totally share your concern, Joris. It's also because enforcing against affiliates so far is done mainly through cease and desists, and even if you would go for a straightforward fine, it's extremely complicated to do cross-border execution, as the Gambling Authority has stated on a number of occasions on its website. So yeah, it's a real problem, and yeah.
So not a solution, but some sympathy for Justin from Justin there. Does that help? It's better than nothing. Okay. Any other questions? In that case, I think I'd like to thank the panel in the usual fashion, and we can move on to what is described in the program as a tea break, although that could be a coffee break as well, since we're in Holland. Thank you very much, Peter Paul, Justin,
Thank you.
David Foster.